Howard University has been intimately involved with this symposium, and we appreciate the opportunity to continue and to learn and to continue and serve the National Medical Association. Thank you, Dr. Mitchell.
Thank you so much, Dr. Morgan. And now, I mentioned earlier, Dr. Jane Cook Wright was a founder of ASCO. She was the only woman in the 7 founders group, and she was the only African American who was a member of the group. And sometimes I used to see the 6 founders of ASCO, and I think it was because it was assumed that since she was the secretary, that she wasn't a researcher. So Dr. Jane Cook Wright. At this time, I would like to have Dr. Sybil Green from ASCO come up and describe the life of Dr. Jane Cook Wright. Dr. Green?
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell. Good evening or good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sybil Green, and I am the Chief Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Officer at the American Society for Clinical Oncology. And it is my privilege and honor to be here today. I'm so humbled. When you do the research on a legacy like a giant, like Dr. Jane Cook Wright, you can't help but be humbled, especially when you think about how far we've come in cancer. And so I just want to take a moment today to share a little bit of what I've learned. Most of what I have are words from others who knew her and who had an opportunity to meet her. Dr. Wright was the daughter and granddaughter of cancer doctors, and forgive me, I never read my presentations, but I just don't want to miss the words here, and a highly accomplished oncologist. She would go on to win many awards and to conduct research on chemotherapeutic agents, many of which are still used today. Descending from a long line of intellectuals, Dr. Wright's father, Dr. Lewis T. Wright, was among the first African-American graduates of Harvard Medical School. His father, also a physician, was also a physician. Dr. Wright's mother was a teacher, and I'd like to think that she was destined to make a difference as she followed in the footsteps of her father, who also devoted his career to cancer care and cancer treatment. She graduated from the ethical culture in 1938, where she studied art at Smith, and then graduated from New York Medical College in 1945 with honors. After training at Bellevue and Harlem Hospital, she joined her father at the Harlem Hospital Cancer Research Center, which he had founded. And together they conducted both lab and clinical trials studying chemotherapy drugs, including methotrexate, and introduced the modern era of what we know as cancer treatment to New York City, to the nation, and indeed to the world. At a time when chemotherapy treatment was largely thought of as experimental, Dr. Wright pioneered the use of anti-cancer agents and developed new techniques for administering cancer therapy. She did this alongside her father, wherein the two began testing a new agent on human leukemias and lymphomas with some success. During her career, Dr. Wright's rigor and attention to scientific investigation focused on patient care, thereby leading her to important contributions to the research of cancer chemotherapy, many of which have helped to change the face of medicine. She did this at a time when African-American women physicians numbered only a few in the United States, and she was ranked the highest African-American woman at a nationally recognized medical institution. She was not only a pioneer in the field of cancer research and treatment, but she was also a leader, opening minds and doors for those who would follow her. Dr. Wright served as an associate professor of surgical research at New York University and director of cancer chemotherapy research at New York University Medical Center and its affiliated Bellevue and University hospitals. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson appointed Dr. Wright to the President's Commission on Heart Disease, Cancer, and Stroke. And in 1967, she was named Professor of Surgery, head of the Cancer Chemotherapy Department, and Associate Dean at the New York Medical College, her alma mater. In 1977, she became the first woman president of the New York Cancer Society. I think there's just, oops, maybe not, okay. In the midst of what was obviously a very rich career in 1964, against the backdrop of racial injustice, Dr. Wright stood as the only woman and the only African American among the 7 founders of the American Society of Clinical Oncology, who developed a strong purpose and vision for an organization focused on facilitating the identification of new methods to approaching the treatment of for people with cancer. I didn't know that there was a time when there were only 6 founders who had been acknowledged. Despite that, however, Dr. Wright's contributions make a huge difference, and I'm proud to say that ASCO's mission statement now includes the word equity because of the work that she did. You know, in 1964, this was also, history will tell us that this was the year where civil rights workers were murdered while attempting to register African American voters. And in South Africa, Nelson Mandela and his colleagues were imprisoned for advocating nonviolent resistance to apartheid. So it was a very tumultuous time. But it was also in 1964 when the Civil Rights Bill became law. And while formal, it did not exactly end racial segregation. About that era, Dr. Wright is known to have said, sure, a woman has to try twice as hard, but racial prejudice, I've met with very little of it. And then she added, it could be I met it and wasn't intelligent enough to recognize it. And we know that's not true. Dr. Wright and her colleagues were fighting to improve cancer, and it could be that her important work in some way shielded her from the battles of civil rights going on around her. But I'm certain that she was aware of the unrest happening all around her. And earlier today, one of ASCO's leaders said that her presence at the table, despite the odds, when ASCO was founded, ensured that there's an organization focused on addressing inequities in cancer care. Dr. Wright passed away in 2013 at the age of 93, but her daughters have shared with leaders of ASCO that she had a deep-rooted belief that everyone deserved equal treatment, although she never mentioned experiencing discrimination herself. They said her goal was to save the lives of people with cancer. It's as simple as that. And her life's work and legacy are a testament to her dedication. We know that advances in cancer have resulted in declining rates of incidence and prevalence in cancer and increased survival rates. But we also know that there are still disparities that lead many African Americans to still suffer from cancer. So there's still work to do. And today's symposium, I am certain, will be in furtherance of Dr. Wright's legacy and ensuring equity cancer care. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Green. At this time, I'd like to introduce the moderator of the program today, and thank you again for being here with us. Dr. Brian Rivers will be the moderator of the program today. He is a professor at Morehouse College of Medicine. Dr. Rivers.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Mitchell. And good afternoon, everyone. It is indeed an honor and a privilege to be before you, tasked with moderating this highly accomplished and esteemed panel of individuals. So I'm just gonna, for the sake of brevity, just really touch on some of the high points of your bio, but I lead you guys to the program booklet for a more comprehensive and exhaustive listing of these dynamic individuals and their respective accomplishments. So we're going to follow the agenda as outlined in your program book. We're going to start off with Dr. Doug Lowy from the National Cancer Institute. Dr. Lowy is the Principal Deputy Director of the National Cancer Institute, National Institutes of Health, and is currently the Acting Director of NCI. He is also the Chief of Cellular Oncology and the Center for Cancer Research at NCI. Followed by Dr. Lowy, we're going to have Dr. James Posey. Dr. Posey, since 2016, has been on the faculty at the Sidney Kimmel Cancer Center at Jefferson as a professor and GI program director for the Division of Solid Tumor in the Department of Medical Oncology. Followed by Dr. Posey, we're going to have Dr. Suresh Ramlian, who serves as a board-certified medical oncologist and is nationally recognized as an investigator and a physician in the area of small cell and non-small cell lung cancer. Dr. Ramlingham also serves as executive director of the Winship Cancer Institute here in Atlanta at Emory University, and also serves as the associate vice president for cancer of Woodrow Health Sciences Center. Followed by Dr. Ramnagam, we're going to have friend and colleague, Dr. Lisa Newman, who is a surgical oncologist with a practice dedicated to breast cancer management. In August 2018, she was appointed to oversee the breast program for the Weill Cornell Medicine, located in New York Presbyterian Hospital Network, serving Manhattan, Queens, as well as its Brooklyn sites. Prior to being recruited to New York, Lisa worked at the Henry Ford Health System, where she served as breast program director, covering multiple hospitals throughout the area of Michigan. Most notably, Dr. Newman also serves as a founding medical director for the International Center for the Study of Breast Cancer Subtypes, currently headquartered at Weill Cornell Medicine. Followed by Dr. Newman, we're going to have Dr. Joseph Michael, who is a professor in the Applied Cancer Research and Drug Discovery Division at the Translational Genomics Research Institute, or more commonly known as TGen, an affiliate of City of Hope Cancer Center. He is also the Chief Medical Officer of the International Myeloma Foundation and Director of Myeloma Research at the Honor Health Research Institute. Followed by Dr. Michael, we're going to have Dr. Alan Bach, who has over 20 years of executive leadership in the nonprofit sector with an emphasis on consensus building as well as collaboration. He has led numerous federal advocacy efforts on a range of issues, both at the legislative as well as the regulatory level. And he became the CEO of both NPAF and PAF in 2013. And I guess we'll learn in your presentation what those acronyms mean. And then followed by Dr. Bach, we'll have Dr. William McDade, who is a Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, also known as ACGME, and also serves as an adjunct professor of anesthesiology at Rush Medical College. Followed by Dr. McDade, we'll have Dr. Doris Brown, who serves as president and CEO of Brown & Associates, a health consulting company. And then last but not least, we will have our very own Dr. Edith Mitchell, who is a board certified in internal medicine and medical oncology and serves as a clinical professor of medicine and medical oncology at Sidney Kimball Medical College at Thomas Jefferson University. As well, she serves as Associate Director for Diversity Programs and Director of the Center to Eliminate Cancer Disparities for Sidney Kimball Cancer Center at Jefferson. And then in acknowledgement, of course, of one of the other program leaders for this dynamic session, Dr. Randall Morgan, who serves as the president as well as CEO of the W. Monarchy Cobb NMA Health Institute based in Washington, D.C. So without further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Douglas Lowy, all the way from NIH, to give us the latest and greatest of happenings at NCI. Dr. Lowy, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dr. Rivers, thank you so much. It really is an honor for me to have been invited to participate in this distinguished symposium that honors the legacy of Dr. Wright. I did not know Dr. Wright personally, but actually she and I went to the same high school, the Fieldston School in New York City, although a number of years apart. And she was one of many distinguished African Americans who had their education at Fieldston. And I want to single out one, Clifford Alexander, who was the first Black Secretary of the Army in the administration in the 1970s, in the Carter administration, because he was another Fieldston graduate, and he was my high school counselor when I was 9 years old. He died last month after a very distinguished career, and his daughter Alexander read her poems at the first inauguration of President Obama. So that's my claim to fame. My first slide has no disclosures, but I should have had on it, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. I'm going to really be giving two talks. First, talking a bit about health disparities at the NCI and covering really three different parts: recent trends in cancer mortality, equity and inclusion at the NCI, and the cancer moonshot. And then after that, I will talk about HPV vaccination, screening, and cervical cancer. This slide depicts for you the recent trends over the last 20 years of cancer mortality by race and ethnicity. On the top, the red, the males are on the left and the females are on the right. And the top represents mortality rates for African Americans. And what I hope you can appreciate is at the start of this century, there was a tremendous disparity between mortality rates among Blacks compared to other racial and ethnic groups. And that disparity has been narrowed considerably over the last 20 years. But there still remains a disparity. And on the next slide, I'm going to show you a one. So the good news is that mortality rates have been going down for all racial and ethnic groups, but they have been going down faster for African Americans, but not so fast that we don't have a gap. We still have a gap. 2 months ago, a paper published by some of my colleagues at NCI called attention to the very high rates of uterine cancer, particularly among African American women in the United States. Black women are twice as likely to die from uterine cancer. And this kind of uterine cancer is not the common uterine cancer associated with obesity, but instead is not associated with obesity, called non-endometrioid uterine cancer. And it only accounts for about 20% of uterine cancer, but more than 40% of uterine cancer mortality rates. And alarmingly, the mortality rates have been increasing by about 3% per year among African American women, and now in recent years, even higher rate among Hispanic women. So there is an urgent need for new research in the affected populations. In the current phase of the cancer moonshot, the NCI recognized that this was a problem, and in addition, that we did not have sufficient genomic analysis of African American men and women. And so this is one of the areas that was designated for looking at the women who have uterine cancer, and really with an overrepresentation, if you will, of Black women. There also is going to be a clinical trial starting soon to test whether the intervention of an HER2 inhibitor might help, because a substantial percentage of these women have overexpression of HER2. What about equity and inclusion at the NCI? And this slide just is a very brief headline of some of the things that we are doing. The first two are where we really have substantial achievement in the sense of new initiatives, addressing cancer disparities and advancing health equity, and increasing the diversity of the cancer research workforce. And I'll have a little bit to say about that. The hardest part is building an equitable and inclusive NCI community. That is the community at NCI, and this is, as we say, a work in progress. Dr. Mitchell and I, at the beginning of February, had the opportunity to be at the White House at the beginning of February when President Biden announced his goals for the new phase of the cancer moonshot. As a matter of fact, Dr. Mitchell and I were sitting next to each other because she knows how to find the best seats. And what President Biden said was, it's bold, it's ambitious. There were two goals shown in blue here: to cut the cancer death rate in half in the next 25 years, and to end cancer as we know it. But the third, equally important part was to address inequities. We can target prevention, detection, and treatment efforts so that all Americans have equal access to cancer diagnostics, therapeutics, and clinical trials. What the Biden administration envisions is what they call an all-of-government effort. So I'll just tell you a little bit about what NCI envisions our role could be. And we have really four distinct pillars. One, invest in the pipeline of new interventions, such as drugs, vaccine, and other things, for cancer prevention, interception, and treatment. That is more, better drugs, fewer side effects. Second, expand clinical trials to speed the evaluation of candidate interventions in diverse populations, racial, ethnic, geographic, and also, I think, of a special importance for African Americans to include people with comorbidities who generally have been excluded from clinical trials. Third, increase implementation research to ensure equitable delivery of current and new standards of care. And fourth, to increase diversity of cancer research and the cancer care workforce so that it resembles more the communities that we serve. Let me talk briefly about expanding clinical trials. NCI has the NCI Community Oncology Research Program as well as the National Clinical Trials Network. And over the last 20 years, we have made a concerted effort to try to increase minority enrollment. And so 20 years ago, there was about 14% minority enrollment to our trials. And in the most recent 3-year period, 25%. And we have data from 2020, it was actually even a little bit higher than the 25%. But increasing enrollment of underrepresented groups is really a key part of the phase of the Moonshot. We need to mimic the at-risk population for the specific cancer studied, and I mentioned that briefly. We need a greater investment so that there is community engagement, and we need more diversity among healthcare providers. What about increasing the diversity of cancer research and the care workforce to resemble the communities that we serve? NCI, for the last more than 20 years, has had the NCI Center to Reduce Cancer Health Disparities, or what we abbreviate because we're inside the Beltway as CRCHD. And Sonia Springfield is the legendary leader of CRCHD. And it was established to reduce the unequal burden of cancer in our society. And you can read on the right side that there are really various approaches, but it's really the key part is to train students and investigators from diverse backgrounds. And we have a number of different programs that have been ongoing, and again, you can see them on the right because there really are diversity training programs. The umbrella of research, the early investigator advancement program, and others. But what about achievement? Well, here are 3 people who have been pure distinguished scholars from CRCHD, and where are they now? Levi Garraway, who has leadership position at Novartis, Valerie Montgomery Rice, who is the president here in Atlanta of Morehouse College, and Robert Wynn, who is the head of an NCI designated cancer center in Virginia. So our commitment to training and mentoring cancer research scholars from underrepresented groups, these are 2 new programs. One is actually the first part of the Cancer Moonshot Scholars Diversity Program. And this is to increase the number of funded R01 early stage investigators from underrepresented groups. Importantly, it is not specifically tailored to a particular kind of cancer research. If these investigators want to do health disparities research, that's great. But if they want to do basic research, epidemiologic research, to do other kinds of implementation research, whatever they want to do, we want to help support them in that endeavor. And a second new one that we abbreviate TEAMS is the Transformative Educational Advancement and Mentoring Network. And this is to really try to pilot programs of training champions who are at minority serving institutions. My last slide is simply to tell you about an upcoming meeting in about 6 weeks, which is the 15th AACR conference on the science of cancer health disparities in racial and ethnic minorities and the medically underserved. It's September 16th through 19th, and it's in downtown Philadelphia. And I only get $150 for each person here in the audience who signs up. And, no, I'm just kidding. But anyway, I've tried to give you a bit of, really a bird's eye view at a high level of some of what we are doing at NCI. Is the job finished? Absolutely not. And it will not be finished, I'm sorry to say, for a long time, but we are working hard at it. Thank you. So I now want to talk about the second topic, which is HPV and cervical cancer. And here I actually have a real disclosure. NIH has patents on the papillomavirus-like particle vaccine technology. I am an inventor. NIH has licensed the technology to Merck and GlaxoSmithKline, the two companies with FDA-approved versions of the vaccine. I will briefly mention genital self-sampling as a potential cervical cancer screening approach. This is not FDA approved. And I'm the inventor of a number of other technologies that have been licensed to a number of companies that are not directly related. First, what's happening with cervical cancer incidence and mortality in the United States? On the left, shown in blue, is the incidence of cervical cancer in African American women, and in green, in white women. What I am afraid you can appreciate is that the incidence in the mid-1970s was twice as high for African American women as for white women. That disparity has been largely erased over the ensuing time period, as you can see with the curves almost matching. But although the incidence has really changed, the comparative incidence, a substantial mortality gap remains. Shown on the right, the mortality rate for Black women, 3.3 per 100,000, is about 50% higher than among white women. And we really need to do things to try to address that gap. So we're really fortunate that there are two preventive approaches, one HPV vaccination and the other cervical cancer screening. Vaccination is for adolescents. Screening is for adult women. And my not very funny headline was that our grandmothers were correct. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Here are the 3 FDA-approved vaccines. One made by GlaxoSmithKline is just for HPV 16 and 18, and you'll see on the next slide why that is relevant. The other, Gardasil, which is a 4 or quadrivalent vaccine, and Gardasil 9, which has a total of 9 virus-like particles. And this is the one that is sold in the United States currently. The others were sold previously, but Gardasil 9 is the only one that is sold currently. This slide depicts for you the incidence of the different kinds of cancers attributable to HPV infection in the United States. On the left, are HPV 16 and 18. And what you can appreciate is that the vast majority of the cancers are due to those HPV types. But then in the light blue are the additional cancers that are attributable to the five additional the five additional virus-like particle types in Gardasil 9 compared with Gardasil. And in white are those that are not targeted, all the way on the right, those not targeted by it. In many ways, this is the most important slide I'm going to show you. This came from this, published from the CDC a few months ago, and what it shows is that if healthcare providers recommend HPV vaccination, as shown in red, about 8 teenagers in 10 get vaccinated. By contrast, shown in green, if the provider doesn't make the recommendation, the uptake of the vaccine is much lower. Just this simple difference. So what about the vaccine? What does it do? It has high efficacy, more than 95% efficacy against the types in the vaccine. It readily induces herd immunity. It confers sterilizing immunity. It prevents infection in most vaccinees, but it does not treat established infection. What about cervical cancer, the major target for the vaccine? These data are taken from Denmark. These are countrywide data. And there's a tremendous difference in the efficiency of the vaccine among young women in the decrease in the risk of cervical cancer. On the left is shown women who were 16 or younger when they got vaccinated, and there's about a 90% decrease in their risk of getting cervical cancer. On the right is women who were over 20 when they were vaccinated, and there's no demonstrated benefit. As time goes on, there will be demonstrated a benefit, but it won't be anywhere near as large as when the young women were vaccinated before they became sexually active. And this is because the vaccine does a really good job in terms of preventing infection. It doesn't really alter the natural history of established infection, and many people get infected in the first couple of years after they become sexually active. What about the question of should we be emphasizing screening or vaccination? Well, of course we should do both. But this modeling effort shows you that we could dramatically reduce the incidence of cervical cancer much faster if we increase screening to 90% than if we increased vaccination to 90%. So screening remains terribly important if we are going to try to address the disparity that I showed you before. And there is an ongoing problem. On the right, this shows you that in the 15 years between 2005 and 2019, the percentage of women who did not get their proper cervical cancer screening went from 14% who didn't get it, that is 86%, were having their screening, to 23%. So only only 77%. This is almost a doubling in the underrepresentation. And we know that about half of the women who develop cervical cancer have been under-screened. So HPV testing is now replacing cytology because there's a high positive and negative predictive value. And unfortunately, it may identify too many early infections that will be self-limited and do not need to be treated. And therefore, ancillary testing is also being recommended. For example, FDA approval of P16 and Ki67 as an ancillary test. And this is the non-FDA approved part. Self-sample genital swabs can detect HPV DNA. It is not yet FDA approved. We are working with the FDA to see what needs to be done in order to try to get approval, because we think that this could help enormously in increasing screening rates. So finally, the American Cancer Screening Guidelines in 2020 are different from the Prevention Services Task Force guidelines. They are recommending to begin screening at 25 years instead of 21. And that's because of the herd immunity that has resulted because of vaccination. And they prefer HPV-based screening every 5 years if a woman is HPV negative. And managing HPV positive results is risk-based. It's based on the molecular biomarkers that are in the HPV cause and the disease development and cytology. So this is a change in the recommendations. As I say, not yet recommended by the United States Prevention Services Task Force. They may look at it. My last slide is, if you will, a summary. Many of you are aware of the unfortunate story of Henrietta Lacks, who developed adenocarcinoma in the early 1950s and died quickly from it. Her adenocarcinoma was attributable to HPV-18. And pap smear screening is known to be not very good at diagnosing and detecting adenocarcinoma as opposed to squamous cell carcinoma. Her cancer should now be preventable either by HPV vaccination or by HPV screening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Lowy, for that outstanding presentation. Next up, we'll have Dr. James Posey. Dr. Posey, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Rivers. Thank you for the organizing committee. Thank you to Dr. Mitchell for extending the invitation. And it's indeed a pleasure to be here to talk with you this afternoon about disparity in colorectal cancer. So this, I wanted to put in a capsule of the evolving landscape of colorectal cancer as we understand it in the U.S., largely in the lower 48. I have no disclosures. I don't know if I'm supposed to state that or if it's obvious from the slide. Key statistics that most of us are acquainted with. Colorectal cancer is fairly common in the United States, among the top 4 malignancies that we see, although decreasing in incidence, as Dr. Lowy mentioned, as one of the many cancers. But yet, still there will be about 140 colorectal cancers diagnosed. And the one note here is that the 12% of patients diagnosed with colorectal cancer that are under the age of 50. This is a notable change in colorectal cancer incidence. I'll show some more slides regarding that. I think starting off favorably, the trend is that the 5-year survival rate for colorectal cancer over a landscape of many decades has improved. Not substantially, or I will say substantially, but certainly there's much room to go. The 2-year survival rates have also improved, and this is, I think, largely in advanced disease, largely as a consequence of therapeutics that have entered the space, and is most notably in patients with rectal cancers. So when we think about reducing risk, colorectal cancer screening, colonoscopy being a gold standard there, has increased among adults over the age of 50. And before 2000, the rates of colorectal cancer screening have increased significantly, and this has resulted in a reduction. Unfortunately, when we look at the incidence of colorectal cancers in younger individuals or those under the age of 50, there's been a gradual increase over a 5-6 year period of time, at least from 2012 to 16, which continues at about 1 to 3% annually. And at the same time, we're seeing a decrease in those over the age of 50. This has resulted in a change in several of our guidelines. And then the other notable disturbing trend is the fact that when we look at colorectal cancer mortality, we notice a major shift, if you will, in residents from poor counties relative to residents from more affluent counties, likely reflecting the access to barrier issues that we'll likely hear about with respect to other malignancies as well. If we look at trends via ethnicity and both in incidence and mortality, the gap where colorectal cancer incidence and mortality has decreased, but the gap still remains. And so, for instance, the incidence of colorectal cancer is about 20% higher. The death rate is about 40% higher. The red arrow pointing at this inflection that we're seeing with an increased rate of colorectal cancer, largely in non-Hispanic Caucasian males under the age of 50. But these rates are significant across ethnic groups. Here, the left side looks at survival by stage or by age group, if you will. And I think that the notable thing here is that the black bar reflects that if colorectal cancer is detected in early stages, so stage 0, stage 1, tumor hasn't really muscular wall or into the muscular wall, and patients have an intervention, namely surgery, the outcomes can be very favorable. Similarly, even with regional disease, the outcomes can be favorable, but we begin to see, we will go to the right bar, or the right side. We may have a control there. No. Yeah, because the bars are, I was going to say green, but they're all kind of greenish. But there is a disparity between, a growing disparity on the right bar when you get to local and regional and distant disease between the darkest green bar and the lighter green bar, reflecting the difference, if you will, in outcome for white versus black patients with more advanced disease. So when we think about risk factors for colorectal cancer, I think we're acquainted with the non-modifiable risk factors, the genetic, those things that we inherit that increase or have the potential to increase our risk for developing colorectal cancer. We say that the risk of developing colorectal cancer is about 4%, 4.4%, a little slightly higher for men than women in the United States. But giving a little bit more attention, or hopefully we can begin to give a lot more attention to some of the modifiable risk factors listed here. Obesity and the dietary factors and the like. I raise a question here about whether or not an infection, Helicobacter pylori, which we know is associated with developing gastric cancer and has also been associated with colorectal cancer. There's data that suggests that there are mechanisms for either direct or indirect as a pro-inflammatory molecule. One of the issues here is we know that there are also differences in exposure as well as who carries a Helicobacter pylori. This study reflecting the fact that the antibodies or seroproteins in this case were about 11% higher in the African American population in this study. And so I think this needs more attention. If we think about the impact that the pandemic has had on colorectal cancer, certainly there is data suggesting that we are likely seeing a little bit of what I would refer to as stage migration. Patients are presenting later because we were shut down for a period of time, and we weren't doing screening, diagnostic screening, which we certainly know can make a difference. And I agree with this statement that if we are confronted with such in the future, we should certainly figure out ways to continue screening, which can often be life-saving. With screening listed here, colonoscopy, I believe being the goal, I would favor as the gold standard because we can evaluate the entire colon. Men have a higher incidence of having lesions in the right colon, polyps, which can subsequently become malignancy. But we know sigmoidoscopy does reduce risk of colon cancer as well as pre-malignant lesions. And then additionally, blood or stool testing, stool-based testing integrated with screening with instrument can be important in terms of getting the ball moving. And this study was published recently, carried out by a group, Kaiser Permanente, looking at, so essentially patients having comparable access. What was observed over a 15-year period of time is a significant decrease, if you will, in the incidence of early stage and even detecting patients with pre-malignant disease. In the top graph, that they didn't really see a decrease in or narrowing of the gap. It was about 5%, but certainly reflecting that screening makes a difference. So when we think about treatment, the hallmark for early stage disease remains surgical intervention. In regional/early stage disease, we're studying the impact of circulating tumor DNA to help with risk stratification and making decisions that may help risk stratify those patients that are at higher risk and whether intensifying therapy makes a difference or not. When we think about the therapeutics that have entered our space, these are just a list of the biologics that have entered the space, integrated with conventional chemotherapeutic agents. And so one of the differences we're seeing these days is the integration of these therapeutics and how they can extend life with colorectal cancer. So when we think about the impact of, for instance, mismatch repair, and that can be diagnosed in a small number of our patients, not just in the genetic means, but as an acquired entity. We know that if one's mismatch repair deficient, chemotherapy or conventional cytotoxics are not helpful, but when it is. So data presented before showing when a checkpoint inhibitor is used for patients that are mismatch repair deficient, there's benefit, right, or far. And more recently, we've learned that a similar PD blocking agent, mismatch repair deficient patients, locally advanced rectal cancer, these patients receive agent targeting that pathway up front. Small number of patients, 100% response rate, Asian, African American, Caucasian patients, all having a very favorable response with minimal toxicity. This will obviously integrate, but only targets a small percentage of our patient population. When you think about clinical trial participation, Dr. Rivers mentioned this to me earlier. When it comes to patients, what's in it for me? First, it always begins with trust, but AAA is where I would say access, appropriateness, and advocacy. Patients being their own advocate, but not just the patient. We have to become an advocate. Patients need to have an advocate with them. We heard a story about that earlier in cardiology, patient advocate. So I think next steps are as follows. Really apply more effectively what we already know. Screening makes a big difference. And then I didn't get into the fact that vitamin D, tree nuts, physical activity all reduce risk of recurrence and can help reduce the onset. And then molecular determinants may play a significant role in how we treat patients. With that,
Floor is yours. Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. It's truly an honor and pleasure for me to speak this afternoon at this symposium. I will talk about some of the major issues in lung cancer and address the problems that we're facing in the clinic right now. And my talk is Advances in Lung Cancer, is it colorful or colorless? These are my disclosures. Now, lung cancer has come a long way in the past 15 to 20 years, from being an untreatable disease where hospice was the only option for majority of the patients in the 1990s. Now we have personalized treatments that are resulting in improvements in outcome for patients. As you can see from this slide, there has been a steady decline in mortality related to lung cancer in the past 15 to 20 years. And this is occurring at a rate of 2 to 4% per year annual reduction in mortality, whether you look at death certificate reported outcomes or incidence-based mortality. This is attributable to a number of factors, and I'll show you one slide each on some of the key advances and some of the areas where we have work to do. Now, the good news is the mortality reduction we see in lung cancer is seen in both white and black patients. And you can see the curve, the maroon bar represents mortality reduction in black patients. So we are heading in the right direction, but I believe that with collaborative effort, we can make the curves go farther downwards faster. And I'll show you some examples of areas where that is needed. We know that one of the major advances in the past 10, 15 years has been that we can detect lung cancer early through use of low-dose CT screening. And this results in a 20% reduction in lung cancer-related mortality and about a 6% reduction in all-cause mortality. So lung cancer screening saves lives, and it's a low-dose single-breath whole CT scan, a tool that's widely available in this country, in our communities. However, if you look at the uptake of CT scan for lung cancer screening, it's pitiful. This is data from 2017. Only about 4% of eligible subjects, these are subjects across the board that had screening. And sadly, over the past 5 years, this trend has not changed. We're still screening only patients, subjects in the single digits. And the interesting here is only 36% of the physicians that participated in the survey were aware of screening criteria. This is 5 years ago. So we have a lot of work to do in educating our care providers and physicians across our communities to screen eligible subjects for lung cancer. The ray of hope is, in the past 2 years, there has been modifications to the eligibility criteria for screening, and early data coming out that specifically in minority populations, the change in this eligibility for screening has resulted in a slightly higher proportion of subjects being screened for lung cancer. Another major advance in lung cancer in the metastatic disease population is personalized therapies based on targeting specific driver oncogenes. This is a pie chart for lung adenocarcinoma, and each slice of the pie represents a patient subgroup that has a specific mutation. And this mutation is critical for the progression of their cancers. And nearly 50% of patients with lung adenocarcinoma have a mutation that's targetable with either an FDA-approved agent or on a clinical trial. So the evidence is clear, and in fact, the 5-year survival for patients with advanced stage disease who have a targetable mutation is now in the 15 to 20% ballpark. However, of great concern is the fact that testing for these mutations is happening at a very low level in our communities. And this is a study that we have reported at the ASCO meeting, looking at the National ASCO Cancer Link database. And you can see here that only about 50% of the patients across the country with adenocarcinoma had next-generation sequencing or molecular testing done. And even more importantly, African American patients had about 10 to 12% lesser likelihood of getting tested for molecular alterations compared to white patients. So making sure that every patient is being tested is critical. We've already published from our institution that if you have an African American patient with a targetable mutation, and if you give them appropriate targeted therapies, they survive the same as patients of other racial and ethnic backgrounds. What about immunotherapy? We know that immunotherapy can produce long-term survival outcomes in advanced stage non-small cell lung cancer. These are some pivotal trials that show that in patients with specific biomarkers, the 5-year survival with immunotherapy with metastatic disease can be as high as 30%. However, African Americans continue to be underrepresented in these clinical trials. This is a New England Journal paper that looked at atezolizumab in advanced stage non-small cell lung cancer. And this trial had close to 600 patients enrolled. And there were a grand total of 4 Black patients enrolled in this whole trial. And this is representative of similar trials of this era. So we have a lot of work to do to make sure that our trials, as Dr. Lowy pointed out a few minutes ago, represent the communities that we serve. The good news is we are presenting data later this week when we look at the ASCO Cancer Link database, national database. 5-year survival rates for advanced stage lung cancer patients treated with immunotherapy, and look at it in the prism of race. African American patients have better 5-year survival rates with immunotherapy compared to white patients by at least 3 to 5 percentage points, which means that the onus is on us to be clear that we ensure every African American patient with appropriate biomarkers receives immune checkpoint inhibitors for advanced stage disease. Finally, participation in clinical trials. These are precision oncology trials looking at specific molecular events in the tumors and enrolling patients based on that. And when you look at the left side, which are ratio of observed to expected number of trial participants, you can see here that African Americans and Hispanic patients have far lower enrollment. And when you look at enrollment based on the specific disease on your right side, lung cancer is one area where Black patients continue to be under-enrolled. So we have a lot of work to do to make sure that our trials enroll, and the point you heard about increasing trust is a key factor when it comes to this. Now, no talk on lung cancer is complete without talking about tobacco control. We know that in the past 50 years, we have done a good job of reducing tobacco smoking in this country. However, there is an alarming trend of use of electronic nicotine delivery systems or vaping products in our communities. As a parent of high schooler, it's alarming to me that nearly 1 out of 4 high school and middle school kids in this country are exposed to vaping products. So we're already introducing tobacco to the next generation of smokers. And of particular relevance is the use of menthol in these vaping products and tobacco products. When you look at middle school students who are exposed to vaping products, specifically African Americans, 70% of the products they use have menthol. And among African Americans who use menthol by age, various age groups among African Americans, menthol use is seen anywhere from 80 to 95% of the subjects. Now the good news is just very recently, the FDA has announced an intent to ban menthol products. And I believe we as a community should support it in every way possible, because this is one way we can have a major impact in reducing tobacco smoking in African American communities and broader communities as a whole. So in conclusion, I believe we're making progress against lung cancer, but if we spend sufficient time and effort to ensure that every patient has access to treatments and testing methodology available today, we will see an even greater decline in those mortality curves. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Alexander. Excellent presentation. Next we'll have Dr. Lisa Newman. Please prepare your questions. We will have a brief panel discussion at the culmination of the speakers.
Thanks so much, Brian. I have no disclosures. Social determinants of health are defined as conditions that we're born in, that we live in, and that have an adverse effect on longevity. And there's no denying that poverty is an extremely powerful adverse determinant of poor health. Since poverty rates are overrepresented in African Americans and Hispanic Latinx, it's not surprising that both of these communities of color suffer disproportionately from medical problems such as obesity, uncontrolled hypertension, and most recently from COVID. However, the unique history of slavery has resulted in systemic racism exerting a particularly treacherous impact on the health of African Americans. And even though slavery was abolished 150 years ago, we see sequela of this history through discriminatory banking practices such as redlining, which essentially kept generations of African American families trapped in neighborhoods that feature food deserts and nutritional insecurity, poorer public school systems, and healthcare access barriers. And so it's not surprising at all that these types of socioeconomic disadvantages result in problems of delays in the breast cancer diagnosis through delays in screening, and this causes a more advanced stage distribution and the higher mortality rates that we see for breast cancer in the African American community. Moreover, we are now learning from research looking at allostatic load that the cumulative life experiences of living in segregated neighborhoods, experiencing racism over a lifetime, living in poverty, all of these effects impact on one's health and on one's cancer burden. There's a very close correlation between racial ethnic identity and socioeconomics leads to the common question of whether race has any biologic or genetic relevance at all, or is it purely a sociopolitical construct? Now, the answer, of course, is that racial identity is both. It is true that how we self-identify as well as how society labels us will impact on how we live, on where we live, and how we access healthcare. However, racial identity is also associated with some very relevant ancestral genetic factors that can also contribute to cancer burden. And we've known for several decades now that factors other than socioeconomics impact and influence on breast cancer disparities, as shown by this nearly 20 years old study where we simply looked at all of publications evaluating breast cancer survival after accounting for some measure of socioeconomic status, and we see the breast cancer survival rates for African American patients remains nearly 30% higher compared to those of white American patients. Furthermore, if we look at some of the most basic epidemiologic statistics regarding breast cancer, incidence rates and mortality rates, we see that the mortality rates for breast cancer are actually similar for blacks and whites until we reach the early 1980s. And at that point, the mortality curves separate, primarily because of declining mortality rates in white women, but largely unchanging rates in black women. And this is probably because we started to unmask differences in tumor biology with the development of endocrine therapy for breast cancer. But endocrine therapy is, of course, only going to be appropriate and effective in reducing breast cancer mortality for ER-positive disease, and black women have notably higher rates of ER-negative tumors. There are also other characteristics that describe the breast cancer burden of black women that cannot necessarily be ascribed to socioeconomics. For example, we tend to be significantly younger when we are diagnosed with breast cancer compared to white women. We have higher risk of adverse tumor features, such as the biologically aggressive triple-negative breast cancers, high-grade tumors, higher population-based incidence of inflammatory breast cancer. There's also very poorly understood higher population-based incidence of male breast cancer in the African American community. So we do indeed have to look at tumor biology and genetics when we try to comprehensively understand breast cancer disparities. Recently, we've witnessed an increase in breast cancer incidence rates in black women, and those rising incidence rates coupled with the higher rates of triple-negative tumors has resulted in a 40% higher death rate from breast cancer in the African American community compared to the white American community. We do, however, have a fighting chance at trying to take care of disparities by screening and early detection strategies. And as shown here, for all racial ethnic subsets of the population, breast cancer survival rates are improved if the disease is caught at an early stage. Even though triple-negative breast cancers tend to be more difficult to detect on screening mammography, as shown here from a study of triple-negative breast cancers from New York, and combined with triple-negative breast cancer patients from Detroit, we see that mammography screen-detected triple-negative breast cancer is the most powerful determinant of improved outcomes from triple-negative tumors. And over the next couple of minutes, I'm just going to talk about some of the strategies that we can implement in addressing earlier detection and more effective treatment of breast cancer to eliminate disparities. In terms of guideline development, the Society of Breast Imagers has been advocating in favor of risk assessment for African American women at even younger ages compared to white American women. We have opportunities for educational curricula that can basically force us to be more introspective regarding our own implicit biases and those of our colleagues in how we deliver breast cancer management. And this is just one example of an educational curricula that I think is very effective, designed by the faculty from the University of Michigan and the University of Maryland, a cultural complications curriculum, a case-based series that can be very nicely integrated in one's grand rounds or morbidity and mortality conference series. Navigation programs are absolutely effective in addressing disparities. The journal Cancer recently had an issue focusing on navigation programs, and this table is taken from one of the included studies where you'll note that funding stability is critical for navigation programs. We can't expect that navigators will be totally volunteer staff. They have to be supported financially. It's important for us to engage our community-based organizations and cancer advocacy groups. And this is a list of just a few of the advocacy organizations that specifically focus on breast cancer education in the communities of color. Definitely important for us to modify our clinical trial and research design. You've heard about this already from the previous speakers. We need to be smarter in terms of oversampling minority patients so that we can get relevant data that truly allows us to evaluate the effectiveness of our cancer treatment advances. This is especially important when we look at genomic studies. Currently, only about 2% of individuals contributing to genome-wide association studies have African ancestry. And so I've been very excited about being able to partner with brilliant translational researchers such as John Van Carpton shown here, where we very much advocate in favor of using ancestry-informative markers in trying to understand cancer biology related to one's ancestral background. My group, the International Center for the Study of Breast Cancer Subtypes, was thrilled to be able to recruit one of John's mentees, Dr. Melissa Davis, about 4 years ago to serve as the scientific director of our team. And Melissa has been a world-renowned expert in the study of a particular variant called the Duffy null variant, which is specifically associated with Western Sub-Saharan African ancestry. And in our international studies, the presence of the Duffy null variant is indeed associated with significantly higher risk of triple-negative breast cancers. This map from Sarah Tishkov simply reminds us that many of the ancestry-informative markers that are identified are not random genetic variants. They are actually markers and genetic alleles that developed over time from evolutionary selection pressure, allowing our ancestors to survive different threats to outcomes such as different infections or food sources. And the Duffy null variant is one such ancestry-informative marker. The Duffy null variant was acquired as a result of evolutionary selection pressure on Western Sub-Saharan Africans to survive the deadly disease of malaria. And so as you follow the African diaspora across to the United States and to different parts of Africa, the presence of this Duffy null variant actually correlates very closely with the prevalence, the frequency of triple-negative breast tumors. The Duffy null variant protects against malaria, as I stated previously. However, the Duffy null variant is now also, we are learning, associated with our ability to balance certain circulating chemokines. And so the Duffy null variant, as well as other variants associated with African ancestry, may well be affecting the memory tissue microenvironment, affecting the risk of these different types of tumors. We're making progress, however, in addressing clinical trials for studying disparities. The bipartisan supported Clinical Treatment Act allowed for better support of clinical trial participation among Medicaid patients. The FDA has now given us a guidance for improving clinical research through accrual diversity. I'm gonna do these slides a little over. Yeah. Okay. I did just want to close by encouraging everybody, now that we're trying to get past COVID, to make sure that we support our safety net hospitals that have suffered disproportionately from the COVID recession, and to address the digital divide. And then lastly, thank you for your time and attention, and please remember to vote in the midterm elections.
Yeah, very much. It's an absolute delight to be here. Thank you, Dr. Newman, for a beautiful presentation. John Carpton and I work together closely, and it's a privilege to be here. Now, you might wonder, in the words of Sesame Street, one of these things is not like the other. We've heard about colorectal cancer, we've heard about lung cancer, we've heard about breast cancer, and now we're going to hear about multiple myeloma. And you might think, isn't myeloma a very rare disease? It is. It accounts for a little less than 2% of all cancers. But I could make a cogent argument today that myeloma actually has the greatest disparity within the African American community of all malignancies. And I think that is why we're at the stage today, and I appreciate Dr. Mitchell's invitation, and being with this amazing crowd on the stage means a great deal to us. I have considerably fewer slides, so I'm going to keep it straightforward. My focus is going to really be on, not only from an academic perspective, but from the perspective, as was shared, I have this duality, and I'm a professor at a Translational Genomics Research Institute, but my primary work is with the International Myeloma Foundation. And we've been working very hard to find ways to overcome these disparities, and we'll share some of that with you. These are my disclosures. So if I were only to show you one slide, it would be this one. At one point, actually, I thought I was only allowed to have one slide. So I prepared this, and then Lily gave me opportunity to add a few more. But here are the key facts. These 7 facts are unfortunate in many respects, but what is the call to action that we have taken to reduce the disparity? So keep it simple. There's a longer time from symptom initiation to diagnosis in myeloma. In fact, it's a problem with all patients, but it's particularly a problem within the African American patient population. So there's a lot, and part of this, as I'll share with you in a moment, has to do with confounding diagnoses like diabetes and others, and of course access to the system, as we've heard. African Americans, on average, are 5 years younger than white patients at diagnosis. Myeloma and its precursor, MGUS, or monoclonal gammopathy of undetermined significance, is twice as common in the African American population. African Americans are less likely to receive what we often call the 3 T's: triplets, transplants, and trials. So triplets are 3 drug combinations. Transplant, referring to autologous stem cell transplant, and clinical trials, as we've recently heard. And these 3 things have significantly impacted the improving survival in multiple myeloma. And one of the reasons why we see half the survival in African American patients than we do in white patients is because access of these 3 things. In fact, now I add a 4th T. For those of you familiar with one of our cutting edge technologies of CAR T-cell therapy, of chimeric antigen receptor T-cell therapy that I have the privilege of being involved with, that also we've just now demonstrated, sadly, has reduced access within the African American communities. From a biological standpoint, there are differences. African Americans are much more likely to have the translocation 1114, which is actually a good prognostic factor, if you will, and are less likely to have the high risk factor of deletion 17p. And how is this translated? As I intimated already, survival outcomes in African Americans are half that of what we see in white Americans. And that's what obviously is simply unacceptable, especially when we consider that, and my final fact is that African Americans can achieve equal, if not better, outcomes when they're given the same therapy. And we've seen this through large VA studies and other situations. So the potential for equal, if not better, outcomes there, and yet survival is half of what it should be, if not, as I say, even greater than that. So the International Myeloma Foundation, we're a relatively small foundation based in Los Angeles, has been very committed to all patients with myeloma for over 30 years, but has been particularly focused within our what we call the Empower Project, M standing for myeloma, Empower, will play on words, to empower patients and communities to change the course of myeloma. Because that current course of myeloma that I just shared with you, I trust, in your heart as well, is not acceptable. And we have tried to do everything we can to improve this course and change this course. And we focus primarily in 3 major areas. 1, community engagement. I'll just show you a few slides or some pictures and some features of what we're doing, where we're trying to raise awareness about myeloma, both through the medical and the non-medical community. So as we'll show you, one of our most beautiful partnerships is with the National Medical Association. with the Black Nurses Association, but also with non-medical organizations, be it fraternities, sororities, churches, community outreach programs. Anyone who's willing to work with us, we want to work with them to raise awareness of the disease so people can recognize those signs and symptoms early, so that we can break the stigma of the disease, and so that we can, as was mentioned several times already today, build the kind of trust that's necessary to not only catch the disease early, but to treat it. Part of this early and accurate diagnosis phenomenon has been in our campaign to primary care providers, where we want to focus on early and accurate diagnosis of myeloma. Part of the challenge is many of the signs and symptoms of myeloma are confounded by other diagnoses. No one walks in with a sign over their head saying, "Hey, I've got myeloma." No disrespect to my, a breast lump or an image showing something on a lung scan, or coughing blood, or often in colorectal cancer, obviously we need screening because it's not even detected. But more often than not, there are relatively well-known signs and symptoms for these things. In myeloma, it's back pain, it's anemia, it's a little bit of renal insufficiency, it's a little bit of neuropathy. It may be none of those or all of those. And very often we have confounding diagnoses like diabetes. And I suspect actually for all of you sitting this long listening to us, we all probably have a bit of back pain in here too. So I'm not trying to make light of a serious symptom, but it does help us appreciate how difficult it is to arrive at the diagnosis of multiple myeloma. So part of our campaign is to try and very carefully and meticulously help primary care providers distinguish the signs and symptoms of diabetes and of mechanical low back pain with what are the more ominous features that we might see in multiple myeloma. Similarly, our outreach has been towards the hematology oncology community to focus on providing care in an inclusive manner, in a manner that's culturally humble, so that we can provide the best care we can for patients, which will influence many of the things we've discussed today, be it clinical trial participation, be it access to therapies, and be it trust within the system. Specifically, I'd like to finally note that we have really worked hard to develop a partnership with the NNA, primarily through our educational programs, even like this one today, where we have worked through webcasts and other educational activities specifically to raise awareness of the significance of myeloma. Because although, as I've mentioned, myeloma is relatively rare, 2% of all cancers, the precursor to myeloma, MGUS, myeloma of undetermined significance, is actually present in 5% of all adults, and likely 10% of all African Americans over the age of 40. I'm an African American over the age of 40, so all of us recognize that this is a very prevalent condition. Thankfully, most people with MGUS won't develop true myeloma, but if we don't follow that, we won't be able to detect it early enough. And as I noted before, African Americans typically, when diagnosed with myeloma, they already have later stage disease because it hadn't been detected earlier. So we've developed a website, the empowered.myeloma.org, and what we have done to try and raise awareness is to work systematically through key cities, but at the same time have a national campaign. So we all recognize that no two communities are the same. So we've worked in Charlotte, we've worked in Baltimore, we've worked right here in Atlanta, and we're soon to launch programs in both New York City and in Tampa, where we kick it off very often with what we call a community outreach workshop. These thus far have been virtual, obviously by virtue of the pandemic, which has made it even more challenging, but we hope to be able to do these in person in the future. And what are we doing here? We're drawing people to a website, drawing people to physical resources. We've had over 250,000 people visit our website already, where they can hear stories about myeloma from other individuals within the community, where I can give them a quick overview. What really is myeloma? What are the signs and symptoms? But also provide resources. So the way I think of it is, whether someone has never heard of myeloma, knows someone with myeloma, may develop myeloma, or has myeloma, there will be an opportunity to provide information and resources to them. We've tried, as I mentioned, to partner with anyone who's willing and able, including WFresh, as you see here. We've done Facebook Live, broadcasts, Twitter Spaces, you name it, all to try and raise awareness around this and engage a community so that they can understand it better, so that we can overcome it better. Similarly, we've tried to work with cancer centers in different places across the country, those that I've mentioned, where now very often myeloma is considered the 5th cancer. We've heard 3 of them already today. Often prostate is added as the big 4, and we've jumped in as number 5, so that we can use these already great community outreach resources to raise greater awareness around multiple myeloma. And then to provide, as my final slide, a bit more specifics as to what I had commented regarding our work with the healthcare professionals. Because of that delay that we see, we've worked very hard in trying to educate individuals to recognize those signs and symptoms early on. We had the privilege of participating at the COB meeting back in April. Now, of course, here today with you, and have created an online resource and a CME certified online resource that individuals can take for 30 minutes. And in that, we break it down in a pretty straightforward manner so that we can recognize the symptoms and know exactly which tests to order. Myeloma is a very evolving field, like all the other cancers that we've heard today. And the old school serum protein electrophoresis is just not enough anymore. We need to round that out with the right amount of testing so that we can arrive at the correct diagnosis. So I'll stop there, and I appreciate very much everyone's attention. Thank you.
Next we'll have Dr. Baldwin. What is yours?
Good afternoon. Great job, Joe. I'm going to break with you, though, and get back to the 30 seconds a slide routine that we've been enjoying all evening. It's great to be on a panel that can go at that speed, so I don't feel so bad. So I do have to explain a little bit about who we are as Patient Advocate Foundation to put our slides into context. Think of us as essentially an emergency room for patients across the country who have social needs, who need financial assistance, who need case management, navigation services. We serve about 180,000 patients per year, primarily low-income, racially and ethnically diverse patients from across the country, representing over 700 different diseases. About 60% of those patients we serve have cancer, and the bulk of those have either breast cancer or multiple myeloma. So I'm going to present some data from you rather than me telling you what patients need. It's actually in 10 minutes I'm going to give you the what, who, how, when, and where of patient needs in cancer disparities. I have no disclosures, somebody put a disclosure slide, thank you. I didn't have one initially. So rather than me telling you personally or anecdotally what I feel like patients need, I'm actually going to give you some data from a representative sample of the patients we serve. That is something we do routinely with our patients, that we give them an opportunity to participate in surveys and research that we conduct in partnership with all sorts of academic institutions. We're about to partner with many of you in this room as well if we aren't already. But this is a more recent sample survey we just did. We're still analyzing the data, so this is hot off the presses. There's about 1,400 respondents total of this survey, about 500 of them were cancer patients. The breakdown here, I'm not going to go through in detail. This kind of reflects generally who we serve as well as patients. That half are over 56. About the average income in this population of patients was about $40,000 per year. In our normal case management, it's about $29,000 per year household income. Most of these patients have insured. About 38% were Black, Indigenous, or persons of color. Most importantly, 82% of the patients in this sample received treatment in the last 6 months, and about 2/3 of them reported that social needs interfered with their treatment in the past 12 months. So these are people who are living the social vulnerability, the social determinants, the social disparities of the world's most expensive and complicated healthcare system. So one of the first things we ask is, what do you need? When you think about your personal healthcare goals, what are those social needs that you need to have addressed? What's important to you? And of course, medical care costs top the list. And this was, you could select all that applies, so multiple options to pick from. But insurance coverage at the top of the list, food and nutrition, utilities, transportation, housing. Probably no surprise to the folks in this room, but what we know is, and what we've been talking about all day, is the things in the middle of this box. The health system is very much built around the clinical aspects of care, and has been that way for a long time. And if we put our economics hat on, we think of the problems that we're talking about here are largely what we consider to be externalities. They sit outside the healthcare system, or are perceived to be. And then you have communities where patients are coming from, and that's the world of charities like ours, community organizations, community health workers, community-based organizations. Everything in between here is that gap that we've got to bridge. Those issues that we haven't figured out how to internalize this problem set into the health system. And when we do that, we can actually start to address health disparities, at least within the context of the health system. This doesn't address all the other issues out there with the built environment, other than the public health issues, but at least in terms of what the health system can do, these are the problem sets that I think if we can internalize them, then we'll get started with trying to address a lot of the disparities and the issues we talked about. So how do we do that? Well, one way, and we're not participating in this is just an observation, but how many of you have heard about Z codes? And how many of you, raise your hand if you're in the clinical setting. This is the participatory part of the evening. Now, keep your hand up here if you know your institution is actually doing something with Z codes, documenting them, capturing them somewhere in the EHR. Okay, just a few. So this is a big effort that's moving forward to try to actually capture in the health record a diagnostic code that corresponds with some sort of psychosocial or social need. And that's important because, you know, if you're going to try to deal with something in the healthcare context, you have to have a diagnosis. And of course, this effort also goes hand in hand with rampant increases in screening for social needs. So how many of you are now incorporating one of the 3 or 4 primary social needs screeners into your health system or into your work every day? So if we start doing this screening and diagnosis, which I think is part of that effort to start to internalize this problem set into the health system, and this is just an example of getting beyond just the 2-digit level. This hasn't started yet, but there's efforts to try to expand the Z code into really microscopic sets of problems like food insecurity, the inability to pay for utilities, worried about losing housing. These are issues that we as Patient Advocate Foundation deal with every day on behalf of patients. So once, as you know, and many of you are healthcare providers, once you start screening and diagnosis, now you've created an obligation to treat. So what we need to think about very earnestly is what is the intervention going to be in the health system against these social needs and about these social determinants? We would actually argue, one question to ask, well, who do you trust? Who is going to provide help when these problems surface? There's a bit of a bias here because these are patients we help. So patient advocacy groups is a trusted source of assistance. But clinic-based social workers, healthcare providers and staff, local community organizations, health plan representatives, even pharmacists are amongst those that could be trusted to help patients with these problems. But it can't be done in an unsystematic and in a diffuse way. We actually have to figure out how to collectively and systematically address this problem. And what we're advocating for, and what I forgot to mention, was the National Patient Advocate Foundation is our advocacy arm. And that's where we advocate for changes in the health system so the system itself knows how to provide better care and services to low-income, racial, and ethnically diverse patients. And I'm proud to say that Dr. Edith Mitchell has been on both our boards for many years and actually currently serves as the president of NPF. But everything in the middle there is what we talked about, those things that happen between the community, the patient, the things that bridge the gap between the lived experience of the patient and their ability to gain equal access to care and treatment in the clinical setting. So social needs navigation is what we feel is important, is the intervention against social determinants. And we're about to launch a considerable effort to socialize, standardize, and scale these services, not ourselves. We've been doing this work for 26 years. We can only do so much of it. But how does the health system actually build social needs navigation in an equitable and fair way, in a systemic way, so it can be, so those quality services can be delivered to patients who need them? And, you know, it's not, what we need to be careful with is that we don't, let me just check our time here. Oh, it's okay. We don't just think about these things as things we manage after treatment has begun, and I think that's the challenge. It's not a PRO type environment where we're just worried about these things. We're going to start to screen for them or manage them after patients have begun treatment. We have to initiate these conversations, start to socialize this problem set at care planning, at care selection. I'm sorry, at the care selection stage and at the care planning stage, and then we manage it as care progresses. And that's where needs navigation comes in early and often. We don't just start navigating and providing case management to patients once they've had a problem, once care is started. We start introducing that intervention at the beginning, early on in treatment. And when we ask that same patient population, well, what are the important topics that need to be discussed as part of treatment selection, as part of care planning? And not surprisingly, cost of treatment tops the list as one of the most important things, but then treatment location, food and nutrition, and for half patients, transportation and housing are critical conversations to have, not just as part of care management, but actually care selection and care planning. And lastly, there's a question of where, right? So I've mostly focused on how to deal with individual patients. How do you build this into your clinical workflow using shared decision-making, using care planning, and social needs navigation? But when we thought about and we challenged ourselves to think about where, we started a concerted health equity effort in 2013 at the community level. We just expanded this, similar to what Joe was mentioning. How do you actually scale a community level approach? So we took how many of you are familiar with the Social Vulnerability Index? All right, so we took that index, which is 15 variables across 4 domains. It's really that social needs soup, right? And we cross-referenced that against a county level chronic disease index that we created using CDC data for cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, and HIV. And when you match those, you overlay those two, you actually create a map of what we consider to be the most socially vulnerable places in the country with the highest burden of chronic disease. And that's where we're trying to make a concerted effort to focus our programs, our services, and our collaboration and research in these counties. Not surprisingly, most of them in the southeast and the southwest. About 83% of them are actually contiguous with another county that made the list from that cross-reference between chronic disease burden and the social vulnerability index. So happy to share this with you and talk more about what we're doing, but I want to close with, and this slide was actually my first slide initially, but I actually think it's the best one to close on. At a very human level, at the most basic level, what patients really need, all patients, but particularly patients that are dealing with social needs and social vulnerability, they need to feel respected, they need to feel listened to, and they need to feel that their care is personalized to them in some way. And part of the way that personalization needs to occur is not just at the genomic level, but the immunological level, but at the social needs level. We need to personally think about and talk to them early and often about their social needs along with their clinical care needs. And when you start to do that, you build the most important thing to really trying to address disparities, and that's building trust. So thank you.
All right, moving along. Our next child speaker is Dr. McDade.
Thank you very much. So great thank you to Dr. Mitchell for inviting me to come and join you to talk about this. Almost every speaker has mentioned the workforce issue with respect to the treatment of cancer, and I'm not going to let you down on that one. I work at my day job for the Acgme, that's the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education. We accredit all of the fellowships, all of the residency programs and many of the fellowships in the country. No disclosures. And so the idea of why diversity matters with respect to the healthcare team, well, Alan just covered it. There's an issue of trust. We live in racially segregated communities. This was covered earlier when we were talking about breast cancer. Disease burden and health and healthcare inequalities are strongly concentrated in these communities of marginalized individuals. We know that people tend to seek care within their own communities, and that historically marginalized practitioners even practice disproportionately in those communities. And then I could show you data, but I'm not today, but the odds are high that a Black, Latinx, or Asian physician will disproportionately see patients of their same race and ethnicity. We refer to this as racial concordance. And then I can show you data also, but I'm not, that the historically marginalized physicians in this country have not changed in graduate medical education over the last 15 years. And so why might someone seek concordant care? Well, we talked about trust a second ago and respect. There's comfort, familiarity, there's language concordance, there's psychological and physical safety, there's perceived shared worldview between the patient and physician. But it's also that there's a race-conscious professionalism that happens on the part of minoritized physicians who want to go back and practice in these communities at disproportionate rates. And there's a sense of being, identifying, belonging in those certain communities. There's also the reality of exclusion from markets and discrimination and racism and elitism that may occur. But racial concordance isn't forcing people to work with patients that they don't want to work with. It's not limiting patients to the best physicians. It's not forcing people to only see physicians of the same race and ethnicity. Proximity is important, but you also have to have a willingness to work in disadvantaged communities and accept government reimbursement. And patient choice obviously plays a role. But it's not a new idea either. This is a picture of Abraham Flexner, who back in 1910 actually wrote chapter 14 where he talked about the medical education of the Negro and this justification of keeping the two African-American medical schools open at the time. There were about 7 at the time, there were previously about 14 altogether, suggested that the reason that you want to have these 2 schools open was in fact that Black patients needed Black physicians to care for them because they wouldn't be cared for by white physicians, and that there was communicable disease that would spread to the white population if you didn't have good care of Black patients. The benefits of racial concordant care, in fact, it addresses the unfortunate reality of how we trust in American society. The intention to adhere to medical advice is heightened, patient satisfaction is typically better, and there's improved clinical outcomes in certain categories, but here's the kicker. It improves access to care for individuals who would rather forego care than to receive care in an environment that dehumanizes them, discriminates against them, or fails to communicate effectively with them. And so at Acgme, we set some foundational principles when we created the office about 3 years ago. We thought that society has to view these health disparities as deficiency in healthcare quality and treat the way that physicians would otherwise treat a quality issue. We think that health equity is a means to achieve elimination of healthcare disparities. We think that increasing workforce diversity is a means to achieve health equity. And we think that inclusion is a tool that's necessary in our learning environments so that we can ensure that diversity is successful. So the action steps that the board of Acgme took was that they changed their mission statement to address the formative piece that programs need around the country to really scale up to be able to do this work in diversity, equity, and inclusion. The board also expanded its vision to explicitly include diversity and inclusion as key elements. And then they modified common program requirements to address diversity, equity, and inclusion. Our office has now developed new tools to assess programs and institutions for compliance and support of these missions, and we've also developed learning communities to continuously improve DEI practices in something we refer to as the Acgme Equity Matters program. As part of that, we've included some questions where we ask programs about what they're doing to expand diversity and to improve the inclusivity of their learning environments. And we've now started to amass them into a resource collection that we hope will be available in Q1 of 2023. We refer to as the Equity Matters Resource Collection. So this is that board work that was done by board members, including Dr. Mitchell, who's a member of that board. We added education explicitly to the mission statement, which is to improve the quality of education of residents such that the ultimate mission to improve healthcare and population health can be achieved. And then we added explicitly diversity and inclusion to the vision statement, which envisioned a GME community that has a global reach, immersed in evidence-based, data-driven clinical learning and care environments defined by excellence and clinical care safety, cost-effectiveness, professionalism, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And our goal is to try to educate more physicians who are going to serve underserved patients in located minoritized communities so we can improve healthcare access, which ultimately improves trust, communication, and outcomes for those most at risk for health disparities. And so when you look at the things that we've done over the last couple of years, the board's changed its program requirement to include explicitly a requirement that asks every program, fellowship as well, in partnership with their sponsor institution to engage in a mission-driven, ongoing, systematic effort at recruitment and retention of a diverse workforce of residents, fellows, faculty, senior administrative GME staff, and other relevant members of the academic community. And when you look at where fellowship programs and residencies can intervene, it's all across the continuum of medical education, from elementary and high school to college and medical school, early in medical school, and not just focus on those fourth-year applicants to residency programs. Fellowships can be involved in the same thing, although their numbers are smaller, but the fact is that we need to have people who are very early in their educational experiences moving in that direction. If you look at the workforce of Hem-Onc fellows in this country over the last 10 years, you'll see that there has not been a year where we've graduated more than 60 African-American Hem-Onc fellows in the entire country. This is the entire 3 years of training, and you'll see that those numbers are awfully low for the numbers of folks who are there who are African-American descent, Latinx descent as well. If you look at those specialties as a function of race, you look at the green bands, which represent African Americans, the red bands represent Latinx individuals, the darker colored women, the lighter colored men in both. Same thing is true for the bottom bands, which are the light blue ones, representing white physicians in training as fellows. You'll see that the increase in the number of positions in Hem-Onc has gone up over the last several years, but you see most of that has been made with respect to white men, Asian women, and Asian men. If you look at those green bars, you'll see that they've been entirely flat over the last decade. Those green bands that represent the African-American contribution, the darker ones women, the lighter ones men, haven't really changed very much at all. And so we have to look at our own ways of admitting people into the fellowships, into the practices, and think, well, what is it that we're saying is excellent that we're not really seeing more African-Americans, Latinx individuals who are involved in training programs, and then think about what's really important as we adjust our ability to try to increase that number. But this is one of the more startling things that we were able to look at our data and see, that in fact, if you look at 50% of all the black fellows in Hem-Onc, they're concentrated in only 11.6% of fellowship programs in Hem-Onc. That there are 172 total Hem-Onc training programs that we accredited at Acgme, and 113 don't have a single African American in all 3 years of training. So we have to think that it's not just that other person is doing the work, that we have to now engage in the same work, because now we have a program accreditation standard that says that we must, And we also have a problem that we see that we're trying to get people into a discipline that is really well underrepresented with respect to diversity. SAS 6B6, or program requirement 6B6, asks that we achieve a sense of belongingness, justice, and respect in our program by saying that all programs and fellowships in partnership with their sponsor institution must engage in a professional, equitable, respectful, and civil environment, free from discrimination, sexual and other forms of harassment, mistreatment, abuse, coercion of resident students, faculty, and staff. I will say that when you look at Acgme data, we don't lose very many people from fellowships once they start. It's the barrier is getting them into the fellowship program to start with. And in going along with 6B6, we know that there are some residents that feel beleaguered and that they don't have enough ability to bring forward problems when they see it in their programs. And this actually has been there already, 2A4A10, is a protection against those individuals who bring forward complaints from retaliation and intimidation. The last thing I'm going to tell you is about board certification, first-time pass rate. We've now changed that so that we can actually try to increase the diversity, de-emphasize the importance of standardized testing on these. We're now starting to collect data on 7-year rolling certificate rates of individuals who take these exams to really look at those things that are actually important and measured, as opposed to things that we historically looked at, such as standardized testing scores. And so the last thing I'll tell you about is the Equity Matters program. I'm going to fast forward and show you the stuff I really want to show you. This is an ability to understand the foundational principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it is free for anybody who goes to the Learn at Acgme website. The link down there, if you want to take a quick picture of it, allows you 18 hours of Category 1 CME credit if you want to go through those 40 areas that we've talked about that provide the axes of diversity in order to learn more about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'll stop there.
Okay. And so next up, Dr. Brown.
Thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me and for Dr. Mitchell for seeing the value in presenting this program. I'm going to talk with you a little bit about the All of Us Research Hub, which is a part of the NIH program. And I would like to just ask how many individuals here have heard of the All of Us Research Program? Yay, great. So now let's ask the tough question. How many of you have registered to become researchers as part of the program? Well, we have to increase that number. So, I think, how do I push this? Oh, that's good. No, let's fix that. Yeah. So good. Well, what I'm going to talk about is the All of Us Research Program, and it's really focused on what you just heard from Dr. McVeigh, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I have no disclosures. The research program started almost 10 years ago, about 8 right now, and it was one of the things, as Dr. Collins, the former director of NIH, indicated, was one of the most ambitious research efforts that our nation has undertaken. It is a study that is a 10-year study at least, to include over 1 million individuals, or participants, I should say, that are living in the United States, to accelerate research, to give us a better opportunity of knowing about what's going on and our health outcomes. And as it relates to a diverse population, you really want to know that it is the right care in the right person at the right time. And so if we were looking at oncology, and as I'm a medical oncologist, we know that we were giving chemotherapeutic agents, and it was the best guess kind of thing. You would give the drug and you hope that it was working based on animal studies and other clinical trials that had gone on. And it might really be the answer, but it might not. And so really the mission of this study is really we're going to try to deliver a better data set for those individuals that are participating so that we can make it more precise. And you've heard about the Moonshot and the other programs that are there, and that's really to look at and hopefully get our patients, our participants involved. I keep saying patients, but members of this study are really participants. It's a shared decision-making tool, so it's not about us giving something to a bunch of community individuals, but it is about a partnership of working together to make sure that we are really giving precise medicine. It's really a very much engaged program that look at the lifestyle of the individuals, the biology. We've heard a little bit about the genetics there, and the environment, and looking at those together so that we can shift our care to be more precise and more individualized. And I've already indicated the right treatment for the right person at the right time. I love the example that we had there. You don't go and get eyeglasses for the person down the street. You get it so that you can increase your vision. And so they tested it to your eyes. And so we want to do the same thing with our healthcare, with our drugs and our other devices. And the key piece for all of us, to me, is that it really looks at the diversity in America, and we want to include the demographics, the geography, and all of that with the data sets to make sure it is very precise for those individuals, and it's going to increase the health outcomes. That's the whole idea of this. And so we talked about the true participants, and I'm just going to give you a little data about numbers in terms of where we are right now. We're inviting over 1 million people to participate. The requirement for you becoming a researcher is really getting up there. We have nearly 500,000 participants that are there. And again, in terms of the studies that are going on, 50% are really matching the racial and ethnic population that is here. And so we are really getting the numbers. This program has really been invigorating in the sense that the NIH, I would say, had it right. I used to work at the NIH, but this time I think they really got it right in that you went out to various segments in the community to ask them to become a partner, to participate in that, to come to the NIH. The NMA Cobb Institute was a part of this study from the very beginning. We did focus groups of making sure that we were going to ask the right questions, we were going to give the right information as a trusted agent of the communities that we serve. And I heard about concordance in terms of providers and patients, and so we really wanted to address that, and we moved forward. So now we're at the point where we have all of this data. We want to have you ask the research questions that are key to your patient population in your community, and you want to be able to become a researcher in this cohort. Yes. So I'm going to move on, but give you some information. You can look at the all of us research side. Generally, and this is again a slow area that generally happens, is the researchers belong to academic centers. Where this study is also wanting to engage non-academic centers. You as an individual can sign up to become a researcher in this program so that everyone is engaged. But we have 3 segments, and I'm going to move through that really quickly. There's the public tier, there's a registered tier, and there's the control tier. And again, the public tier, meaning that you will register as an individual and you can write the question and you can get access to the data. One question that I will say, because I see the next person coming up, is individuals that participate in the study, we always worry about our data getting out, oh, somebody's going to get my information. It is de-identified so that you are not going to have your information out on the web, on TikTok, and some of the other things. It's unknown. You become a number in that study, and it is safe. They do many areas of looking at and making sure the security of the information is there. But we need to increase that number of hands that I saw becoming researchers so that we can get better health outcomes for our patients.
Last but not least, Dr. Edith Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rivers, and thank you for managing and moderating this program this afternoon. And thanks to the audience for staying here. Quickly, and then we'll have time for just a couple of questions. So COVID-19, we've heard about for more than 2.5 years, and this is the first NMA meeting in person since that time. So COVID-19 and cancer, really very important. And I chose the topic, COVID-19, and what physicians treating patients with cancer need to know. So I have no, what do you call it? Disclosures. So what do we know? We know that the NCI just last month reported information from March of 2020 to October of 2021 using national death certificate data. And it was reported by the National Cancer Institute that COVID-19 accounted for 1 in 8 deaths, or 350 deaths in the United States during this time. Heart disease was the #1 cause, cancer was #2, and COVID #3. Also, accidents were the 4th cause, and stroke was the 5th cause. But in every age group, 15 and older, COVID-19 was one of the top 5 causes of death during this period. So a picture of what COVID has caused. I'm going to pass on the next couple of slides and encourage everyone to get the information from the CDC website, because it does change. It changes frequently, and we need to keep up with change. So note the vaccination indications, the guidelines, the booster doses, and what we need to give. Understand that side effects can occur. Most of these side effects are not so advanced, and they usually resolve in 3 days. If they don't resolve in 3 days, we need to check that patient and see what else is going on. There is one rare side effect of COVID-19 vaccines, and that is prominence of axillary lymph nodes in the extremity, the arm, where the dose is received. It can occur with the first dose, the second dose, or boosters. And one thing that you want to notice, many people mistake this as progression of metastatic disease in those patients with active cancer treatment. And what we need to do, if the patient is due a mammogram, ask them to wait until at least a month, unless there is an urgency in obtaining that imaging study. And then for diagnostic scans, wait at least a month, again, after the injection, so that this is not interpreted as disease progression. So that's very important. And for our patients, the vaccines are safe. The COVID-19 vaccines are not active viral vaccines. They are not live viruses, and therefore they may be given while the patient is on cancer treatment. And that, again, is very important because many patients don't want to get the vaccine because they think it might affect the cancer or the cancer treatment negatively. At the vaccines, and for those on active cancer treatment, it's very important, especially if the patient has lymphomas or leukemias. So talk with your patients about receiving the appropriate vaccine recommendations. There is another compound, Evusheld. It's not a replacement for a vaccine, but it is available for individuals who may not be able to get the vaccine, who may be allergic, or may have had other difficulties with vaccines. And I say to everybody, review the CDC and updates very frequently. They do change, we're getting more information. The National Cancer Institute is actually continuously doing research studies, so update yourselves. And for those individuals who have tested positive for COVID-19, evaluate for any possible long-term outcomes for patients. And some have heard of this as the long haulers. So I'd like to thank everybody for being here today. Wanted to show you just a couple of pictures of Dr. Jane Cook Wright. I had the pleasure of meeting her at an ASCO meeting, and she and I kept in touch with each other. I researched her family, and her daughters tell me, you know more about our family than we do. So this is Dr. Jane Cook Wright. Dr. Wright not only was a researcher, a clinician, a smart woman who researched the drug methotrexate, and guess what? We're still using methotrexate now. This is Dr. Wright on the left with some of her social programs that she worked with, and at the bottom left is her father with former First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. And Dr. Wright and her father were confidants and researchers who advised President Roosevelt. And it was her father who said to President Roosevelt, quit building those separate and unequal hospitals, and therefore integrating or beginning the integration process of hospitals. And on the right is Dr. Wright receiving the Lifetime Legacy Award from the National Medical Association. It was a combination of NMA and ASCO, as well as Acgme, presenting this to Dr. Wright. And you might recognize Dr. LaFall, Dr. Robert Comas, Dr. Morgan was here, and I guess that's me over on the other side. But at any rate, it was a combination of the organizations that she had an effect on. So if you want to stay, and if our panelists can all stay just a couple of minutes, I will take a couple of questions, and make sure your question is short, precise, and well stated, and we'll see what we can do.